Fired and Vindicated: How One Expert's Exit Exposed a Toxic Boss. Imagine watching an arrogant boss destroy everything he worked for because he thought he could push around the one person he needed most. This is the story of one man's ego spiraling out of control, leading to a project disaster he never saw coming. They say that every great project needs a leader and a team that respects one another's skills. But when an arrogant boss crosses the line, treating someone he needs with utter disrespect, the outcome can be disastrous. This is the story of David, a highly skilled historical restoration expert, and the boss whose arrogance turned an $800,000 project into a nightmare. Our story starts with David, a craftsman and restoration expert whose work has been featured on some of the country's most famous historical landmarks. David had spent years honing his craft, relearning techniques that were nearly extinct, mastering the skills needed to restore ancient structures without compromising their integrity. He had an almost mystical understanding of his work, seeing every wall, every stone, every faded detail as if it held memories of the past. David's dedication to historical restoration went beyond mere skill. It was a passion that drove him. Where others saw worn bricks and crumbling mortar, he saw stories waiting to be told. His work was like piecing together a forgotten history, restoring structures with the same tools and techniques used centuries ago, preserving not only buildings, but the very essence of history. When David was called in for this project, he immediately felt a surge of excitement. This wasn't just any renovation, it was a large-scale restoration of a building with centuries of history embedded in its walls. This structure had witnessed generations come and go, and its preservation was crucial. The investors funding the project were sparing no expense, recognizing the importance of having a true expert like David on board. As David arrived on site for his first day, he took in the sight of the building, a sense of reverence washing over him. He knew he was standing before something irreplaceable. With his toolbox in hand, he walked toward the team, who were already gathered and waiting. Many of them were familiar faces, people he had worked with in the past who respected and valued his expertise. David's first day began with him meticulously assessing the structure. He ran his hands over the stones, noting their textures, feeling for cracks, understanding the points of vulnerability. He could sense where the stones had weakened over time, where the mortar had crumbled, where the building had endured, and where it was starting to give in. Every wall told a story, and David was there to make sure those stories would endure. But David wasn't alone. Overseeing the entire project was a man everyone had nicknamed Noisy Gobshite. His real name was Nathan, but the nickname had stuck after years of him berating his team with a loud, abrasive voice that seemed to demand respect through volume alone. Noisy Gobshite wasn't just loud, he was arrogant, a man who thrived on authority and control. His approach to leadership was straightforward. People followed orders, or they got out. To Nathan, this project was just another feather in his cap, a high-profile job that would elevate his career if he could keep it on budget and on time. He wasn't interested in the intricacies of historical restoration. As far as he was concerned, construction was construction, and all he needed was a team who would follow his lead without question. He saw specialists like David as an inconvenience, people with inflated egos who needed to be put in their place. As David worked, Noisy Gobshite watched from a distance, arms crossed, assessing him with a look of mild disdain. He saw David's attention to detail as unnecessary, an indulgence that was slowing down the project. Where David saw art and history, Noisy Gobshite saw dollars and deadlines. The first interaction between them happened in a way that David found unsettling. As he was inspecting one of the walls, David noticed Noisy Gobshite approaching. The boss walked up, his face set in an expression that bordered on a smirk, as if he was challenging David's methods before even understanding them. "So, you're the specialist they brought in?" Noisy Gobshite sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "They told me you were supposed to be some kind of expert." David straightened, his face calm, but inside, he felt a flicker of frustration. He'd dealt with dismissive bosses before, but there was something particularly grating about this man's tone. The implication that David's years of experience, his dedication to a dying craft, meant nothing to him. "Yes, that's right," David replied evenly. I'm here to make sure this building gets the attention and care it deserves. This structure is older than most people realize, and it requires very specific techniques to restore it properly." Noisy Gobshite scoffed, glancing dismissively at the wall David had been inspecting. "Looks like any other wall to me. Stones, bricks, mortar. Can't see what all the fuss is about." David clenched his jaw but kept his composure. "With all due respect, it's not just about bricks and mortar. These stones were laid hundreds of years ago, and if we don't treat them carefully, we risk losing the integrity of the entire building. It's not about rushing through it. It's about preserving it for future generations." The boss's smirk only grew. "Preserving, huh? You're making it sound like this is a museum piece. We're not here to indulge your little restoration fantasies. We're here to get the job done. So why don't you save the history lessons and stick to the basics?" David took a steadying breath. He knew that arguing with Noisy Gobshite wouldn't lead anywhere productive. He'd faced resistance before, but this was different. There was a level of arrogance in the man that was palpable, a refusal to understand, to listen. David decided, then and there, that he would let his work speak for itself. No matter how dismissive Noisy Gobshite was, he couldn't deny the quality of David's expertise. Throughout that first day, the tension between them only grew. Noisy Gobshite made it a point to hover around David, observing his every move with a critical eye, occasionally making offhand remarks about how slow the work seemed to be going. David kept his focus, determined not to let the man's arrogance interfere with his work. He treated the walls with care, handling each piece as if it were a fragile relic, painstakingly restoring areas that had suffered years of neglect. As he worked, David couldn't shake the feeling that Noisy Gobshite was waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake he could pounce on. It was as if he were searching for any excuse to belittle David's work, to assert his own dominance over the project. At one point, David overheard Noisy Gobshite talking to one of the other team members. "I don't know why they're paying him so much for this," he muttered, casting a sidelong glance at David. "I've worked on enough projects to know that restoration is just an excuse to charge more for simple work. It's all the same in the end, but they call it specialized so they can jack up the price." The comment stung, not because David cared about the man's opinion, but because it reflected a total lack of respect for the craft he had dedicated his life to. To Noisy Gobshite, historical restoration was a gimmick, a way to make more money off people who didn't know any better. As the day went on, David found himself struggling to keep his emotions in check. He'd faced skepticism before, but this was different. Noisy Gobshite's arrogance, his refusal to respect David's expertise, went beyond mere ignorance. It was a deliberate dismissal, an insult to everything David stood for. David took a break, stepping outside to collect his thoughts. He stared at the building, letting his frustration melt away as he focused on the work ahead. He reminded himself why he was there, why he had taken on this project in the first place. It wasn't for the boss or for the money. It was for the building itself, for the history it held, for the legacy he was helping to preserve. "I'm not doing this for him," David told himself, a renewed sense of purpose filling him. "I'm doing this for the craft, for the history, for the people who came before me. His arrogance can't change that." He went back inside, more determined than ever to let his work speak for itself. If Noisy Gobshite couldn't see the value of his expertise, then so be it. David would do the job he was hired to do, and he would do it well. But little did he know, this would be just the beginning of a conflict that would soon spiral out of control, leading to consequences none of them could have foreseen. The days that followed were filled with a steady rhythm of microaggressions and belittling remarks from Noisy Gobshite. David, ever the professional, did his best to brush them off, focusing on the details of his work and reminding himself of the purpose he held in the project. But every day, Noisy Gobshite found new ways to undermine him, making offhand comments that chipped away at David's patience. One morning, David arrived on site early, hoping to get a head start before Noisy Gobshite arrived. He was deep in the middle of restoring a delicate section of the wall when he heard the familiar stomp of Noisy Gobshite's heavy boots behind him. He ignored it, continuing to work, his hands steady as he carefully applied a traditional lime mortar to the ancient stones. "Good morning, David," Noisy Gobshite called out, his tone overly cheerful in a way that put David on edge. He braced himself, knowing that a seemingly polite greeting was often the prelude to some underhanded criticism. David turned and nodded, giving him a polite but restrained morning, before turning back to his work, hoping that keeping his answers brief would discourage more interaction. But Noisy Gobshite wasn't the type to take a hint. "So," Noisy Gobshite said, leaning casually against a stack of materials, as if he had all the time in the world, "how long do you think it's going to take you to finish that section? We're running behind already." David suppressed a sigh, carefully choosing his words. "I'm nearly done with this part," he replied, keeping his tone professional. "But it's important to let the mortar cure fully before moving on. If we rush it, we risk damaging the structure." Noisy Gobshite scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Damaging the structure? Come on, it's a wall. Just get it done and move on to the next part. We don't have time for all this fussing around." David bit back a retort, instead responding evenly, "This isn't just any wall. It's a historical structure. If we don't follow the proper steps, we could be jeopardizing the entire project. It's my job to ensure that it's done right." The boss's face hardened, a glint of irritation flashing in his eyes. "And it's my job to keep this project on schedule," he snapped. "You're not here to give history lessons, David. Just do the work you're being paid for and leave the rest to me." David felt his frustration building, but he knew better than to argue. Instead, he turned back to his work, letting Noisy Gobshite's words wash over him. He reminded himself that his work spoke louder than any words ever could. After weeks of enduring Noisy Gobshite's constant undermining, David began to feel the weight of the project pressing down on him. The work itself was rewarding, and he loved the challenge, but Noisy Gobshite's presence tainted every moment of it, turning what should have been a fulfilling project into a daily grind of stress and irritation. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, David met up with his friend Paul for a drink. Paul was also in the construction business, and he understood the unique challenges that came with working on high-stakes projects. As they settled into their seats at a quiet pub, David found himself venting, finally releasing the frustration he'd been bottling up. "Every day, it's something new with him," David said, shaking his head. "He treats me like I'm just some hired hand, like my years of experience mean nothing. I've tried to ignore it, to focus on the work, but he just doesn't stop." Paul listened intently, nodding in sympathy. "Sounds like a real piece of work. I've dealt with guys like that before. They're all about power. They don't respect anyone who doesn't fit into their little world of control." David took a sip of his drink, feeling a bit of the tension easing as he spoke. "Exactly. He doesn't understand the work I'm doing, and he doesn't care to. He only sees the deadlines and the budget, and he thinks that's all that matters." Paul leaned forward, his expression serious. "But you know your value, David. Don't let one arrogant boss make you question that. You've been brought on because you're the best. Remember that." David nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He knew Paul was right. Noisy Gobshite might be dismissive, but David's work was vital to the project's success. He resolved to stay focused, no matter how difficult Noisy Gobshite made things. The very next day, David's patience was tested again in a way he hadn't expected. He arrived on site early, hoping for a quiet morning, only to hear raised voices coming from the far end of the project area. Curiosity piqued. He walked over, finding Noisy Gobshite mid-rant, berating one of the junior workers on the team. The young worker, barely out of training, stood frozen under Noisy Gobshite's fury, his face pale as he tried to stammer out an explanation. But Noisy Gobshite wasn't listening. He loomed over the worker, his voice loud and cutting, tearing into him for a minor mistake as if it were a catastrophic failure. "You think you can just slack off on my project?" Noisy Gobshite sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I don't care if you're new. If you can't handle this job, then maybe you should find another line of work." David watched, anger simmering as he witnessed the way Noisy Gobshite treated the young man. He could see the humiliation and fear on the worker's face, could feel the weight of Noisy Gobshite's oppressive presence bearing down on everyone around him. As Noisy Gobshite finished his tirade and stormed off, David walked over to the worker, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't let him get to you," he said quietly. "Everyone makes mistakes, especially when they're learning. He shouldn't have treated you like that." The young man nodded, clearly grateful for David's support. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice shaky. "It's just, I didn't expect this. I thought working on a project like this would be exciting, but he makes it so hard." David understood all too well. In that moment, he realized that Noisy Gobshite's behavior wasn't just about him. It was a pattern, a toxic approach that he inflicted on everyone around him. And with that realization, David's resolve only strengthened. He wouldn't let this man ruin the project, or his love for his craft. Over the next few days, David found himself wrestling with a growing sense of resentment. Noisy Gobshite's presence cast a shadow over everything he did, turning each task into a reminder of the disrespect he endured daily. He was there to restore something beautiful, to preserve history. But every time he picked up his tools, he was reminded of the man who saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience. One evening, as he worked late, alone on site, David paused to look around at the walls he was restoring. The building was quiet, the only sound the faint echo of his footsteps. He ran his hand over the ancient stones, feeling their rough texture beneath his fingers, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, letting himself feel the connection he'd always had to his work. But the peace was fleeting. His mind kept returning to the confrontations, the dismissive remarks, the way Noisy Gobshite seemed intent on tearing him down. David clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He wanted to stay for the project, to see it through, but each day, it felt harder and harder to ignore the disrespect, the constant belittling of everything he stood for. In that quiet moment, David made a promise to himself. He would finish this project, but he wouldn't tolerate Noisy Gobshite's behavior indefinitely. If push came to shove, he would stand up for himself, even if it meant walking away. The tipping point came on a rainy day, when David noticed that one of the upper scaffolds had started to shift, the old wood creaking under the weight of the recent rainfall. He reported it immediately, knowing that a collapse could lead to serious injury. But when he brought it up to Noisy Gobshite, the response he received was infuriating. "Are you serious?" Noisy Gobshite said, rolling his eyes. "A bit of rain and you're worried about the scaffolding? Just get back to work, David. We're behind schedule as it is." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "This isn't just a bit of rain," he argued. "The wood is old, and it's already showing signs of strain. If we don't fix it, someone could get hurt." Noisy Gobshite waved him off dismissively. "You're overreacting. You're here to work, not to play safety inspector. I don't have time for this." For David, this was the final straw. It was one thing to disrespect his work, to undermine his expertise, but to endanger lives out of sheer arrogance was something he couldn't tolerate. He knew, in that moment, that his patience had run out. The project might mean everything to him, but his integrity and the safety of his team came first. As David walked away, he felt a calm determination settle over him. Noisy Gobshite had made his decision, and soon enough, he'd have to face the consequences of his arrogance. As the weeks wore on, David's tolerance for Noisy Gobshite's antics was hanging by a thread. Each day the tension grew, and every encounter with the boss left him feeling more disrespected and demoralized. But David was determined to hold his ground, to finish the project that meant so much to him. He could feel the weight of history in every brick and stone he worked on, and he wasn't about to let Noisy Gobshite ruin that. Then came the morning that would change everything. David was deeply focused, carefully applying a specialized lime mortar to one of the oldest sections of the wall. His movements were slow and deliberate, each stroke precise as he worked to preserve the integrity of the ancient stones. Out of nowhere, he heard the loud, grating voice of Noisy Gobshite behind him. "Hey you, David?" the boss called, his voice filled with that familiar tone of entitlement. David took a deep breath, setting down his tools and turning around to face him. Noisy Gobshite was standing there with an impatient look on his face, arms crossed as if he were waiting for something. "Go fetch me a coffee, will you?" Noisy Gobshite demanded. "Black. And make it quick. I've got a meeting to get to." For a moment, David was stunned into silence. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Here he was, in the middle of a meticulous restoration process, working on a section of the building that required intense focus and care. And this man had the nerve to demand that he stop everything to get him a coffee? David straightened, his face calm but his eyes filled with a steely resolve. "I'm here to restore this building, not to fetch coffee," he replied, his voice steady and unyielding. Noisy Gobshite's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger crossing his face. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Did I just hear you say no?" David met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, you did," he replied. "I'm here to do my job, to ensure that this building is preserved correctly. My time is better spent on the work I was hired to do." The boss's face turned red with fury, his hands clenched into fists as he took a step closer to David. The silence that hung in the air was thick with tension, and David could feel the eyes of the other workers on them, everyone holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. "Do you know who I am?" Noisy Gobshite hissed, his voice barely controlled. "I am the one in charge here. I am the one who makes the decisions. And when I tell you to do something, you do it. Do you understand me?" David felt his own anger rising, but he held it in check, refusing to let Noisy Gobshite intimidate him. "I understand that I was hired for my expertise," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "And I'm here to do the job I was trained for. Fetching coffee isn't part of that." Noisy Gobshite's face twisted into a sneer. "Well, if you're not willing to follow simple instructions, then maybe you don't belong on this project at all," he spat, his voice filled with contempt. David looked him in the eye, knowing that this moment would likely change everything. But he wasn't about to back down. "If you feel that way, then maybe I don't," he said, simply, his voice steady. The silence that followed was deafening. Noisy Gobshite glared at David, his face contorted with rage. For a moment, it seemed as though he might back down, as though he could see the determination in David's eyes and realize that he was making a mistake. But his pride was too great, his ego too inflated to allow him to backtrack. "Fine," he shouted, his voice echoing through the building. "You're fired. Pack up your things and get out. I don't need someone who thinks they're too good to follow instructions." David felt a pang of anger and sadness, a sense of loss for the project he had poured so much into. But he also felt a profound sense of relief. He had stood up for himself, refused to be disrespected, and now he could walk away with his dignity intact. As he turned to gather his tools, he noticed the looks of shock on the faces of the other workers. Some of them nodded at him in silent support, their expressions filled with sympathy and admiration. They knew, as well as he did, that Noisy Gobshite was in the wrong. David gathered his belongings slowly, deliberately, savoring the final moments on the project he had cared so deeply about. Before he left, he took out his phone and discreetly recorded a quick message, summarizing the details of his firing. He wanted to have proof, something to protect himself if Noisy Gobshite tried to twist the story later on. As he walked toward the exit, Noisy Gobshite called after him, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Good luck finding work after this, David. People talk, you know, and I'll make sure they know what kind of attitude you have." David paused, looking back at him one last time. "If people talk, then maybe they'll realize the truth," he replied calmly. "And the truth is that respect goes both ways." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Noisy Gobshite standing there, fuming, his face red with anger. After David left, the atmosphere on site was tense and filled with an unspoken dread. The other workers exchanged uneasy glances, knowing full well that David's departure would have serious consequences. They had all seen the quality of his work, the care he took in preserving the structure, and they understood that he was irreplaceable. One of the junior workers, a young woman named Sarah, approached Noisy Gobshite cautiously. "Sir, are you sure it was a good idea to fire David?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "He's the only one who really understands the techniques we need for this restoration." Noisy Gobshite scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, please. He was just a contractor. There are plenty of other workers who can do the same job. He wasn't anything special." Sarah exchanged a worried glance with another worker, but she didn't press the issue. They all knew it was useless to argue with Noisy Gobshite when he was in one of his moods. But as they returned to their work, a sense of dread settled over them. They could feel the weight of the project's future pressing down on them, the uncertainty of how they would move forward without David's expertise. As David walked away from the site, a whirlwind of emotions flooded over him. There was a part of him that felt liberated, relieved to be free from Noisy Gobshite's toxic presence. But there was also a sense of loss, a deep sadness for the project he had cared so much about, the work he had poured his heart into. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze on his face, and allowed himself a moment to process everything. He had always known that standing up for himself might come at a cost, but he hadn't expected it to feel quite like this. He felt a pang of regret, not for his decision, but for the building he was leaving behind. As he walked, he replayed the events of the past few weeks in his mind, analyzing every interaction, every insult, every moment of disrespect. He had tried so hard to make it work, to focus on the project and let his work speak for itself. But in the end, Noisy Gobshite's arrogance had been too great a barrier to overcome. David knew that his skills were rare, that his knowledge was valuable, and he took comfort in that. Noisy Gobshite could dismiss him all he wanted, but the truth was that David's work spoke for itself. He knew he'd find other projects, other opportunities to use his skills, and this time, he would work with people who valued and respected his expertise. That evening, David sat down at his kitchen table, his mind still racing from the events of the day. He knew that Noisy Gobshite would likely try to twist the story, to paint him as difficult or insubordinate. It was a common tactic with people like him, to place the blame on others and avoid any responsibility. With a steady hand, David began drafting a detailed account of everything that had happened, including specific instances of disrespect, the moments when Noisy Gobshite had undermined his expertise, and finally, the events that had led to his firing. He wanted a record of everything, something he could refer to if he ever needed to explain his side of the story. As he wrote, he felt a sense of clarity and control returning. This wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about reclaiming his voice, his narrative. Noisy Gobshite had tried to strip him of his dignity, to belittle him in front of his colleagues. But David wouldn't let that be the final word. When he finished, he saved the document and sat back, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He might have lost the project, but he hadn't lost himself. He knew who he was, and he knew the value of his work. And one day, he was certain, Noisy Gobshite would have to face the consequences of his own arrogance. The day after David's departure, a tense silence lingered over the construction site. The other workers felt the absence of David's presence like a missing pillar, a steadying force they hadn't fully appreciated until he was gone. Even the building itself seemed to echo with a sense of loss. The delicate restoration process interrupted, leaving parts of the structure vulnerable and exposed. Noisy Gobshite arrived on site, wearing a smug expression, but his confidence quickly began to falter as he observed the nervous energy among his team. The workers moved more slowly, their hesitance palpable as they avoided the intricate restoration areas that David had been responsible for. They whispered among themselves, casting wary glances at the walls David had left unfinished, each of them unsure of how to proceed. Noisy Gobshite could sense the unease, but he dismissed it, attributing their caution to a lack of backbone. As far as he was concerned, they were overcomplicating things. Restoration or not, it was still just a building. Surely, someone else could pick up where David had left off. He ignored the anxious looks from the workers and barked out orders, determined to push forward with the project as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, and everyone else could feel it. By midday, it became painfully clear that moving forward without David wasn't as simple as Noisy Gobshite had imagined. The workers were unfamiliar with the delicate techniques David had employed, and attempts to replicate his methods quickly led to mistakes. A small crack appeared in one of the walls, then another, a warning sign that the structure was becoming unstable. Panic set in among the team, and even Noisy Gobshite couldn't ignore it anymore. Reluctantly, he pulled one of the workers aside. "We need a replacement," he muttered, unwilling to admit just how dire the situation was. "Find someone with experience in restoration. Call around, see who's available." The worker nodded, but there was a hint of doubt in his expression. "I can try, but people like David, there aren't many who have that kind of expertise, and the ones who do are usually booked months in advance." Noisy Gobshite clenched his jaw, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He didn't want to hear excuses. As far as he was concerned, everyone was replaceable, David included. Just do it, he snapped, turning away, unwilling to entertain the possibility that he might have made a mistake. The team began making calls, reaching out to other contractors and specialists, but every response was the same. Either they were unavailable, or they refused to take on the project out of loyalty to David. Word had already spread about David's firing, and in the small, tightly knit world of historical restoration, loyalty mattered. No one wanted to work under a boss who disrespected one of their own. As each call ended in disappointment, Noisy Gobshite's confidence wavered. He had never faced this kind of resistance before. To him, loyalty was irrelevant. Money talked, and that had always been enough to get people on board. But now, he was beginning to realize that money couldn't buy the respect he had so thoughtlessly dismissed. With no one to replace David, the project fell further behind schedule. The workers attempted to continue the restoration, but their efforts were clumsy, lacking the precision and care that David had brought. They tried to stabilize the walls with temporary fixes, but the cracks continued to spread, spidering through the ancient stone like a web of fragile veins. As the days passed, the building itself seemed to be unraveling. The mortar that David had so carefully applied began to flake away, weakened by the lack of proper curing time. One section of the wall buckled slightly, a small but ominous sign that the integrity of the structure was compromised. The workers, already on edge, grew increasingly anxious. They avoided the more delicate areas, fearing that any misstep could lead to a collapse. Noisy Gobshite, still clinging to his authority, berated them for their caution, accusing them of wasting time and resources. "This is ridiculous," he muttered one day, glaring at the team as they hesitated over a particularly fragile section of the wall. "It's just stone and mortar. Stop babying it and get the job done." One of the senior workers, a man with years of experience but no specialized training in historical restoration, spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't just stone and mortar. This building is centuries old. If we don't handle it with care, we risk causing irreversible damage." Noisy Gobshite's face twisted in irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by one of his own workers. "If you're so worried about damaging it, then maybe you're not cut out for this job," he sneered, his tone laced with contempt. The worker fell silent, unwilling to risk further confrontation, but the tension among the team only grew. They knew they were in over their heads, but Noisy Gobshite's arrogance left them with no choice. The project was spiraling out of control, and everyone could feel the impending disaster looming over them. Meanwhile, David was watching the situation unfold from a distance, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. He had heard through industry contacts that the project was in trouble, that Noisy Gobshite was struggling to keep things together without him. Part of him felt vindicated, knowing that his departure had exposed the boss's incompetence. But another part of him felt a deep sadness for the building itself, the history it held, and the care it was being denied. David's friends reached out to him, asking if he would consider returning to the project if Noisy Gobshite reached out. But David's answer was always the same, only if the boss met his conditions. He wouldn't compromise his self-respect, not after everything he had endured. One evening, David sat by his window, gazing out at the city lights as he reflected on his decision. He felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had stood up for himself. Noisy Gobshite might have fired him, but David had reclaimed his dignity, and that was worth more than any paycheck. Still, a part of him couldn't help but worry about the building. He had poured so much of himself into that project, invested countless hours in understanding its intricacies, its vulnerabilities, and now, with each passing day, he knew that the structure was suffering without the care it deserved. As the situation grew increasingly dire, Noisy Gobshite finally swallowed his pride and reached out to David. He sent a brief, clipped email, demanding that David return to the project and finish what he started. The tone of the message was as arrogant as ever, as if Noisy Gobshite still couldn't bring himself to show any respect. David read the email with a wry smile, unimpressed by the boss's attempt to assert control. He didn't respond immediately, letting Noisy Gobshite stew in his desperation. The longer he waited, the more emails and messages flooded his inbox, each one more frantic than the last. After several days of silence, David finally replied, setting his terms clearly. He would return only if he was paid for the days he had missed, received an in-person apology from Noisy Gobshite, and was given the full project fee up front. He knew these demands would be difficult for Noisy Gobshite to accept, but he wasn't willing to compromise. Noisy Gobshite's response was swift and furious. He refused to meet any of David's conditions, accusing him of being unprofessional and ungrateful. He even hinted at possible legal action, threatening to sue David for breach of contract if he didn't return to work. David's reply was simple and direct. I will not return without my conditions being met. If you choose to pursue legal action, I have documented proof of my firing, and I am prepared to defend myself. The response left Noisy Gobshite seething, but he knew he had no leverage. He was trapped, his pride warring with his desperation as the project continued to fall apart around him. Back on site, the workers were beginning to lose hope. They had done their best to continue without David, but the cracks were spreading, the mortar was weakening, and each day brought new setbacks. The building itself seemed to protest their clumsy attempts at restoration, its ancient walls buckling under the strain. Sarah, the junior worker who had questioned Noisy Gobshite after David's firing, felt a knot of anxiety growing in her stomach with each passing day. She watched the structure deteriorate, powerless to stop it, knowing that they were inching closer to disaster. One afternoon, as she worked on a section of the wall, she noticed a larger crack forming, a deep fissure that cut through the stone like a scar. She froze, her heart pounding as she realized the severity of the damage. If they continued, the entire section could collapse, taking months of work and a significant portion of the building with it. She approached Noisy Gobshite, her voice filled with urgency. Sir, we need to stop. This wall isn't stable. If we keep pushing, we could lose everything. But Noisy Gobshite dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. We're too far behind to stop now. Just reinforce it with more mortar and keep going. Sarah wanted to argue to make him see the danger they were facing, but she knew it was futile. Noisy Gobshite's arrogance was blinding him, leading them all toward inevitable disaster. As word of the project's decline continued to reach him, David found himself feeling a strange mixture of emotions. He had been tempted, at times, to go back, to step in and save the structure he cared so deeply about. But every message from Noisy Gobshite, every disrespectful word, reminded him why he had walked away in the first place. David knew that his principles mattered more than the project. He had stood up for himself, refused to let someone diminish his worth, and he wasn't about to back down now. No matter how much he cared for the building, he couldn't compromise his dignity, his sense of self-respect. He stayed firm, even as the project continued to spiral out of control, watching from afar as Noisy Gobshite's empire crumbled brick by brick, stone by stone. The situation had grown increasingly dire for Noisy Gobshite. Days had turned into weeks, and each passing moment chipped away at his confidence. The cracks in the walls had worsened, and with no expert on hand to manage the complex work, the project's integrity was deteriorating rapidly. The investors were growing impatient, demanding answers as the project fell behind schedule. The only option left was clear: he needed David to come back. But reaching out to David was a bitter pill to swallow. Noisy Gobshite's pride was wounded, and the thought of apologizing was unthinkable. Still, his desperation outweighed his ego, and he knew he had no other choice. One evening, he sat down to draft an email, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he struggled to find the right words. The message he eventually sent was short and reluctant, dripping with barely concealed resentment. David, we need you to return to the project immediately. Your expertise is required to complete the work. Please consider finishing what you started. David read the email, his lips curling into a slight smile at the carefully worded, emotionless message. He could tell Noisy Gobshite hadn't changed. He was simply using formal language to mask his desperation. David decided not to respond right away, letting Noisy Gobshite wait, fueling the desperation he knew the boss was feeling. When he finally replied, his response was clear and unyielding. I will consider returning under the following conditions. 1. Full payment for the days missed due to my firing. 2. A face-to-face apology for the way I was treated. 3. The entire project fee paid up front. David knew these terms were bold, but he had no intention of it unless Noisy Gobshite met every condition. After all, his dignity was worth more than any paycheck. Upon receiving David's response, Noisy Gobshite's face turned red with fury. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through his empty office as he read the email over and over, each word stinging his pride. An apology? Upfront payment? He scoffed at the thought, his anger boiling over. In his mind, David's terms were an insult, a direct challenge to his authority. He couldn't believe that a mere contractor would have the audacity to make demands. For a moment, he considered simply hiring another replacement. But he knew, deep down, that finding another expert with David's skills was impossible. He was trapped, caught between his need for David's expertise and his refusal to submit to David's conditions. Unable to control his anger, Noisy Gobshite sent a curt reply, filled with barely veiled threats. David, this is unacceptable. Your attitude is highly unprofessional. If you do not return without these unreasonable conditions, I will consider legal action for breach of contract. Noisy Gobshite assumed that the threat of a lawsuit would force David to reconsider, to fall back in line. But he underestimated just how resolute David had become. David wasn't afraid, and he had prepared for this very moment. With a calm but assertive tone, he replied once more, I have documented proof of my firing, and am prepared to defend myself. If you cannot meet my conditions, I will not return. David felt a sense of calm as he pressed send, fully aware that he was risking his career by standing up to Noisy Gobshite. But he didn't regret his decision. This was about more than just the project. It was about setting boundaries, standing by his principles, and refusing to allow himself to be mistreated. Over the next few days, Noisy Gobshite bombarded David with increasingly frantic emails, each one more desperate than the last. He tried various tactics, from promises of partial payment to vague apologies that skirted around the actual issue. But David saw through every attempt, recognizing them for what they were: manipulative ploys to get him back on site without ever acknowledging the mistreatment he had endured. Finally, in a last-ditch effort, Noisy Gobshite sent an email that hinted at a reluctant willingness to meet David's demands. But even then, he couldn't bring himself to offer a real apology, instead framing it as a misunderstanding and suggesting that David's absence was a miscommunication rather than an outright firing. David's response was final and resolute. Unless I receive a full direct apology and upfront payment, I will not return to the project. With that, he cut off all communication, leaving Noisy Gobshite to face the consequences of his actions. As the days dragged on, Noisy Gobshite's team began to lose faith in his leadership. They could see the project deteriorating before their eyes, each attempt at restoration leading to new problems and further damage. Morale was at an all-time low, and whispers of doubt began circulating among the workers. Sarah, the junior worker who had questioned Noisy Gobshite earlier, found herself growing more disillusioned with each passing day. She had once been excited to be part of a historical restoration, but now, the project felt like a farce, a tragedy in the making. One afternoon, during a break, she confided in a colleague, her voice filled with frustration. I don't understand why he doesn't just bring David back, she murmured, glancing nervously over her shoulder. We're in over our heads here, and he knows it. Why can't he just admit he made a mistake? Her colleague shook his head, his expression weary. It's his pride. Noisy Gobshite can't handle the idea of someone standing up to him. He'd rather let the whole project fall apart than admit he was wrong. The workers' frustrations began to bubble over, and soon, minor conflicts erupted on site as tensions reached a boiling point. Without David's steadying influence, the team struggled to maintain any sense of unity or purpose. The once promising project had devolved into a chaotic mess, a testament to Noisy Gobshite's arrogance and the damage it had caused. As the project continued to falter, the investors began demanding answers. They had poured significant funds into the restoration, and they expected results. But all they saw were delays, mounting repair costs, and a building that seemed to be deteriorating faster than it was being restored. Noisy Gobshite tried to placate them with vague explanations and empty promises, assuring them that everything was under control. But the investors weren't fooled. They had received reports from others on site, accounts of the shoddy work and the cracks spreading through the walls, and they were growing increasingly alarmed. During a tense meeting, one of the lead investors finally confronted Noisy Gobshite, his tone cold and unforgiving. "We invested in this project because we believed in your ability to lead it," the investor said, his voice filled with barely restrained anger. "But what we've seen so far is a disaster. You promised us a restored building, not a pile of rubble. If you don't get this under control, we're pulling our funding." Noisy Gobshite's face paled as he realized the gravity of the situation. He was on the verge of losing everything: the project, his reputation, his career. But even then, his pride held him back, preventing him from fully acknowledging the extent of his failure. In a desperate bid to buy himself more time, he promised the investors that he would make things right, that he had a plan in place to resolve the issues. But in reality, he had no plan, no solution. All he had was a crumbling building and a team that had lost faith in him. With nowhere else to turn, Noisy Gobshite made one last attempt to manipulate David into returning. This time, he framed his message as a plea, attempting to appeal to David's sense of responsibility for the building itself. "David, I understand that we had our differences, but the building is suffering without your expertise. I know you care about it as much as I do. If you truly want to see it restored, please come back. We can work something out." But David wasn't swayed. He could see through Noisy Gobshite's thinly veiled attempts at guilt-tripping. This wasn't about the building, or the project, or even the preservation of history. It was about Noisy Gobshite's ego, his refusal to admit that he had been wrong, that he had underestimated the value of David's work. With a sense of finality, David crafted his reply, each word carefully chosen to make his stance unmistakably clear. "I will not return without my conditions being met in full. This building deserves respect, and so do I." When Noisy Gobshite received David's final message, he knew he had lost. There would be no compromise, no convenient solution to the crisis he had created. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him reeling as he stared at the cold, unyielding words on his screen. In his mind, he replayed every interaction he'd had with David, every dismissive comment, every arrogant remark. He had believed with absolute certainty that he could bend David to his will, that he could control the situation with threats and intimidation. But now, he saw the truth. David's respect and expertise were things he couldn't buy, couldn't manipulate. He had underestimated the very person he needed most, and now he was paying the price. As the reality of the situation sank in, Noisy Gobshite felt a sense of dread settle over him, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. The project was on the verge of collapse, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His desperation had driven David away, and now he was left to face the consequences alone. The negotiation was over. David's silence spoke louder than any words ever could, a final act of defiance that left Noisy Gobshite with nothing but his own failure. With David's final refusal echoing in his mind, Noisy Gobshite was left scrambling. He knew the investors were watching him closely, and the weight of their expectations loomed over him like a storm cloud. He couldn't afford to admit defeat. Doing so would mean losing everything he had worked for. But with David gone, his options were dwindling fast. In a desperate attempt to keep the project moving, Noisy Gobshite hired a replacement contractor, someone with minimal experience in historical restoration. The new worker was skilled in general construction, but had no specialized training in handling centuries-old structures. Noisy Gobshite brushed off the concerns raised by other workers, insisting that the new contractor knew enough to get the job done. "Just follow the blueprint," Noisy Gobshite told him, waving a dismissive hand. "This isn't rocket science. It's just old stone and mortar. You don't need to be some fancy expert to do this." The new contractor nodded, clearly eager to prove himself, but his eyes held a flicker of doubt. Even he could see that the structure was fragile, that each stone required a level of precision and care that went beyond his training. But with Noisy Gobshite breathing down his neck, he pushed his reservations aside and got to work, unaware that he was walking into a disaster. Within days, the consequences of Noisy Gobshite's decision became painfully clear. The replacement contractor, lacking David's expertise, struggled to replicate the delicate techniques required for the restoration. His inexperience led to mistakes, small ones at first, hairline cracks that went unnoticed, but soon the issues grew more severe. One morning, as the team worked on reinforcing a section of the wall, a loud cracking sound echoed through the site. The workers froze, their eyes widening in horror as they watched a section of the ancient stone shift, a deep fissure snaking across its surface. The wall trembled, groaning under the weight of its own age, and then, with a sickening lurch, a piece of it crumbled away, sending dust and debris cascading to the ground. Panic erupted among the team. The workers scrambled to assess the damage, their faces pale with shock. The building that had stood for centuries was falling apart before their eyes, its historical legacy crumbling under the weight of reckless hands. Noisy Gobshite arrived on the scene, his face twisted with fury. He demanded to know what had happened, his voice booming as he berated the workers, blaming them for the collapse. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was the result of his own arrogance, his refusal to value David's expertise. He had forced the project forward without regard for the consequences, and now those consequences were laid bare for all to see. The collapse of the wall didn't go unnoticed. News of the incident reached the investors quickly, and within hours they demanded a meeting with Noisy Gobshite. They had invested significant funds into the restoration, and they expected results, not a crumbling building and mounting repair costs. Noisy Gobshite entered the meeting with a forced air of confidence, but the investors weren't fooled. They could see the cracks in his composure, the desperation in his eyes. They demanded answers, their voices filled with anger and disbelief. "This project was supposed to preserve history," one investor said, his tone icy. "But all we see is reckless handling and escalating expenses." "What happened, Mr. Gobshite? You assured us that everything was under control." Noisy Gobshite swallowed, struggling to maintain his composure. He launched into a convoluted explanation, blaming unforeseen structural weaknesses in the building and implying that the team's incompetence was to blame. He conveniently left out his decision to fire David, hoping to deflect responsibility. But the investors weren't buying it. They had received reports from other workers, accounts of the disrespect and mismanagement that had plagued the project since David's departure. They knew that David had been the linchpin holding everything together, and they weren't willing to let Noisy Gobshite off the hook. "Enough with the excuses," one of the lead investors snapped. "We know what happened. You fired the only person who understood this building, the only person capable of doing this work properly. And now, you expect us to clean up your mess?" Noisy Gobshite's face paled, and for the first time a flicker of fear crossed his eyes. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had no defense, no way to justify his actions. He had burned every bridge, alienated every ally, and now he was left with nothing but his own failure. As news of the project's collapse spread, Noisy Gobshite's reputation began to unravel. The investors, furious with the state of the project, took drastic measures to salvage their investment. They released statements to the public, distancing themselves from Noisy Gobshite and highlighting his mismanagement as the primary cause of the project's failure. The story made headlines, local newspapers and industry journals alike, covering the scandal with fervor. Articles detailed the project's initial promise, the historical significance of the building, and the tragic downfall brought on by reckless decisions and arrogance. Noisy Gobshite became a symbol of hubris in the industry, his name synonymous with failure. The coverage included testimonies from workers who had witnessed the events firsthand, each account painting a damning picture of Noisy Gobshite's behavior. Sarah, the junior worker who had witnessed his mistreatment of David, shared her story with a local journalist, her words laced with frustration and disappointment. "He treated David like he was nothing, like his expertise didn't matter," she told the reporter. But David was the only one who understood the building, the only one who could do the work right. Noisy Gobshite's arrogance destroyed everything. The public backlash was swift and severe. Clients canceled contracts, colleagues distanced themselves, and potential investors withdrew their support. Noisy Gobshite's career, once promising, was now in shambles, the weight of his actions crushing him under the very ruins he had created. From afar, David watched as Noisy Gobshite's empire crumbled, feeling a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Part of him felt satisfied, knowing that justice had been served, that Noisy Gobshite was finally facing the consequences of his arrogance. But another part of him felt a deep sadness for the building, for the history that had been lost due to one man's recklessness. David's friends reached out to congratulate him, expressing their admiration for the way he had stood up for himself and refused to be mistreated. But David, ever humble, shrugged off the praise, his mind still lingering on the project that had meant so much to him. One evening, as he walked through the city, he found himself standing in front of another historic building he had worked on years before. He ran his fingers over the stones, feeling the same sense of reverence he had always felt for his craft. In that moment, he was reminded of why he did this work. Not for recognition, not for validation, but for the buildings themselves, for the legacy they represented. He knew that he would find new projects, new opportunities to preserve history, and this time he would work with people who understood the value of his expertise, who treated him with the respect he deserved. As the weeks passed, Noisy Gobshite's life continued to unravel. His name was blacklisted in the industry, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. He struggled to find new clients, each rejection a painful reminder of his downfall. Former colleagues avoided him, unwilling to associate with someone whose arrogance had led to such a public disaster. In a final attempt to salvage his career, Noisy Gobshite tried to reach out to David, hoping for a reconciliation that might restore some semblance of respect. But David, having moved on, politely declined, making it clear that he had no interest in revisiting the past. Left with nothing, Noisy Gobshite was forced to face the harsh truth. He had destroyed his own future. His empire, once built on intimidation and control, had crumbled, leaving him isolated and disgraced. The irony was undeniable. He had treated David as if he were replaceable, only to discover that David's expertise was the very foundation of his success. Now, with his career in ruins, Noisy Gobshite was left to reflect on his mistakes, haunted by the knowledge that he had brought this downfall upon himself. David's story didn't end with Noisy Gobshite's downfall. He went on to work on other projects, each one a new opportunity to apply his skills and preserve history. His reputation grew, and he earned the respect and admiration of colleagues and clients alike, each one recognizing the value of his expertise. As he moved forward, David carried with him a quiet sense of triumph, a victory won not through force or confrontation, but through dignity and self-respect. He had stood up to someone who had tried to belittle him, who had refused to see the worth in his work, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his own value. In the end, the story wasn't just about one man's fall from grace. It was a reminder of the importance of respect, of the need to value others' skills and expertise. David's journey was a testament to the power of integrity, a story of quiet strength in the face of arrogance. And as he continued his work, he knew that his legacy would endure, not just in the buildings he restored, but in the respect he had earned along the way. David's story serves as a powerful lesson in humility and respect. He walked away from a toxic situation, refusing to be diminished, and in doing so, he exposed the dangers of unchecked arrogance. His journey wasn't just about preserving history. It was about standing up for himself, for his craft, and for the values he held dear. Ever had a boss who underestimated you? Share your story below and subscribe for more real-life tales of karma and redemption.